Today's topic is reflexive verbs. This is the term for verbs where, for whatever reason, the subject acts on itself. The action taken by the subject reflects back on itself. In English, you'll hear this with pronouns like myself, yourself, himself, herself, etc. In German, this becomes more complicated because of case. Sometimes the reflexive pronoun will be in the accusative case, and sometimes the dative case. So here's a quick review of cases in German. You use the accusative case for a direct object, in other words, the noun that receives the action of the verb. The dative case is used for indirect objects, or in other words, the nouns to whom or for whom the direct object is acted upon. Let's begin with the times the reflexive pronouns depend on case, in the first person and second person singular forms. When you use a reflexive verb with the subject ich, the reflexive pronoun becomes mich when used in the accusative case, and mir when used in the dative case. If the subject is du, the options are dich in the accusative or dir in the dative case. Now here's the great news. With any other subject, the reflexive pronouns are the same, whether they're in the accusative case or the dative case. For instance, uns, meaning ourselves, and euch, meaning yourselves, are the same in both cases. And even better, in the third person, you don't need to account for gender with reflexive pronouns at all. You always just use the reflexive pronoun sich for third person singular and third person plural. Here are some examples of how these look in context. Ich habe mich verletzt. Hast du dich verletzt? Ich kaufe mir ein neues Buch. Was kaufst du dir? Meine Mutter interessiert sich nicht für Politik, aber mein Vater interessiert sich für Politik. Wir treffen uns um 20 Uhr. Interessiert ihr euch für Sport? Der Mann und die Frau lieben sich. A couple comments about how these things look. First of all, notice that we've used accusative reflexive pronouns with the verb verletzen, because when you injure yourself, you're both the subject and the direct object, hence the accusative case. But with the verb kaufen, when you buy yourself something, you're the subject and the indirect object. You're not being bought, you're buying a direct object for yourself. So we've used the dative case with those reflexive pronouns. Also, notice the use of the reflexive pronoun sich in the last example. This sentence might look like the man and the woman love themselves, which would be rather egotistical. Actually, the plural reflexive pronouns uns, euch, and sich can also be translated as each other or one another. Finally, here's something you may have noticed about the examples you see here. It probably doesn't make intuitive sense to you to even be using a reflexive pronoun in some of these sentences. What makes reflexive verbs most difficult for English speakers is that there are very few verbs in English that absolutely require reflexive pronouns. Sure, I can buy myself a book, or I can get myself ready for a party, and then behave myself badly at the party, but for the most part, that reflexive pronoun is not even strictly necessary in English. Furthermore, I certainly don't use a reflexive pronoun when I look forward to something, remember something, hurry, relax, thank someone, or concentrate. But in German, all of those verbs must have a reflexive pronoun. Again, this is tough for English speakers because you have to use a reflexive pronoun with some verbs in German where you don't in English. And when you try to translate those German sentences verbatim to English, they don't sound right. But just remember, German isn't English, and English isn't German. Let's look at a couple verbs where it does make slightly more intuitive sense to an English speaker to be using reflexive pronouns. Sich benehmen, to behave oneself, sich vorbereiten, to prepare oneself, or sich etwas kaufen, to buy oneself something. If I want to say who behaves themselves, I could do it like this. Ich benehme mich schlecht und meine Katze benimmt sich auch schlecht. Here I use mich as the reflexive pronoun for the subject ich in the first part of the sentence, and then sich matches with the subject Katze in the second half of the sentence. Or I could say, wir bereiten uns auf die Schule vor. We prepare ourselves for school, and use the reflexive pronoun uns to match the subject wir. Or I can say, ich kaufe mir eine Banane, using the reflexive pronoun mir to show that the subject and the indirect object are the same person. Here's a quick aside about the case of the reflexive pronouns. Annoyingly, there are times when it is flexible. Let's look back at the verb verletzen. If I injure myself, I'm my own direct object, then I say ich verletze mich. But if I want to specify what part of myself I injure, then that body part becomes the direct object, and I shift the reflexive pronoun into the dative case. Ich verletze mir das Knie. The same concept applies to a verb like waschen. Ich wasche mich just generally means that I wash myself, but ich wasche mir die Hände means that I wash my hands. Again, I'm using a reflexive pronoun because I'm doing the washing to myself, not to a different object. But since I've specified a direct object of that washing, I shift that reflexive pronoun into the dative case. So far, we've seen some verbs where it makes pretty intuitive sense to English speakers to use reflexive pronouns in the first place. But now we're going to get to some verbs where it makes much less sense to English speakers to use a reflexive pronoun. Sich beeilen, sich fühlen, sich freuen auf, sich etwas vorstellen, sich etwas wünschen. If you translate any of these sentences to English, you probably don't actually need a reflexive pronoun at all. I guess you could say, I hurry myself along, but it's not absolutely necessary. This takes a lot of getting used to, but the more often you see and hear these verbs, the more it becomes a habit and just starts sounding natural. For reference, here's a very brief, not at all comprehensive list of some useful reflexive verbs in German. Sich beeilen, sich benehmen, sich erinnern, sich freuen auf, sich fühlen, sich interessieren für, sich vorbereiten auf, sich etwas vorstellen, and sich etwas wünschen. Let's review. Reflexive verbs are verbs where the subject acts on itself. Reflexive pronouns are sometimes accusative, for direct objects, and sometimes dative, indirect objects. Ich becomes mich or mir, du becomes dich or dir, but with sich, uns, and euch, case does not matter. And watch out, there are a lot of German reflexive verbs that are not reflexive in English, so you'll have to learn those verbs carefully. Thanks for watching, and happy Germaning!